on saanud 2, avan põhiseaduskomisjoni.
So it's 2 p.m. and I open the public sitting of the Constitutional Committee.
Hello to our dear guests. Komisjoni istung toimub
The committee sitting will take place in Estonian. If you would like to listen to the interpretation, everyone has a headset on their desks. Today, we have invited many international guests to talk about the frozen assets. And I would also like to say that we are sitting in a conference hall with Ukrainian children's art on the wall. They have drawn their pets that they had to leave behind in Ukraine. To start, let's hear the video statement by Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian minister.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Parliament, Chairman and members of the Constitutional Committee, Khalid Sibrat, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to address you today. Parliament is at the heart of every democratic state. Riigikogu is Estonia's democratic heart. I believe this is the appropriate place for me to say thank you. Thank you for all the support. I'm grateful to Estonia and every Estonian for the weapons your country has provided to our brave warriors over the past 2 years. You were among the few who transferred them even before the full-scale invasion began. Your javelins helped stop the enemy on the approaches to Kyiv and Chernihiv. Your ammunition helped liberate the Kharkiv region and Kherson. Your howitzers strengthened our defense. Estonia pushed for sanctions, and they helped slow down Putin's war machine. Estonia provided tons of humanitarian aid, enabling thousands of people in destroyed cities to survive the winter. Estonians also welcomed Ukrainians fleeing the war. I know you made those decisions from the heart, and we'll always be grateful to you in our hearts. Supporting Ukraine is not charity. It is an investment in international peace and security. Putin's Russia resurrected the sickest forms of aggressive Russian imperialism. It is clear that the appetites of its conquest go far beyond Ukraine's borders. And only a powerful and well-armed Ukraine can stop and defeat Russia before Putin encroaches on other countries. Only a defeated Russia will be forced to accept just peace. You and I understand it well. It is our joint task to make the rest of the world realize this. Estonia has already given Ukraine everything and more. 17 packages of defense assistance totaling 502 million euros, or 1.4% of GDP. This is really impressive. I understand that your weapons supply capabilities are limited, but I also know that Estonia has an inexhaustible resource that it skillfully uses. This resource is leadership, the willingness to be the first and ironclad political will to achieve the goal. This was how the ammunition and IT coalitions appeared. This was how the 3-year victory strategy for Ukraine was introduced. This was how Estonia decided to provide long-term strategic support to Ukraine at a rate of 0.25% of GDP over the next 4 years. This is how we achieved EU candidate status for Ukraine, and more recently the decision to begin EU accession talks. Today, we truly need your leadership on accountability. We all understand that the true end of the war is only possible once justice is restored. Ukraine's damages must be compensated from frozen Russian assets. I know Estonia has already developed a compensation mechanism that involves the use of assets for Ukraine's reconstruction. Last year, you considered the government's bill in its first reading and sent it for further consideration and amendments. It now awaits your final approval, dear Estonian legislators. I understand that this is a complex decision with many factors to consider. At the same time, I'm certain that taking this bold step is necessary. This is not about financial gain, but about a fundamental obligation to uphold international law and human rights. I would like to dispel a few misconceptions that prevent a sober assessment of the situation and sow unfounded fear about the consequences of this decision. For instance, some say that such action would violate the principle of the rule of law. On the contrary, asset confiscation will strengthen it. By holding the aggressor accountable, we reinforce the rule of law and ensure that justice prevails over brute force. The 2001 UN Articles on States' Responsibility for Internationally Wrongful Acts lay out a clear legal framework for this action. They require states responsible for international wrongful acts to make reparations. In light of Russia's aggression, the confiscation of frozen assets is a legitimate countermeasure. Other skeptics argue that confiscating the assets would destabilize the global financial system. This fear is equally unfounded. The world's leading credit rating agencies have already dispelled it. Furthermore, there is currently no alternative to Western currencies, meaning that it is unlikely that asset confiscation will harm trust in them in any meaningful way. Actually, we believe that inaction poses a far greater risk to global stability because it indirectly incites violations of international norms. By proceeding with the confiscation, we are also setting a precedent that will serve as a deterrent to other potential aggressors, signaling that the international community is willing and able to enforce accountability. Beyond the legal and economic considerations, there is also a humanistic dimension. The confiscated assets will be essential in rebuilding affected areas, assisting victims, and restoring hope. This is our opportunity to stand on the right side of history and demonstrate that our values are more than just words. They are principles that we are committed to defending. Dear members of Riigikogu, the decision you are about to make will send a message of strength well beyond Estonia's borders. It will demonstrate your commitment to international peace, security, and the rule of law. By passing legislation to confiscate frozen Russian assets, you will make it clear that aggression will not be tolerated and justice will be served. Ukraine and Estonia cannot change geography, unfortunately. Russia has been and will remain our aggressive neighbor. No illusions. The Russian dictatorship and the mindset of ordinary Russians show no signs of change. They are willing to kill, lie, and deny. Imperial madness is consuming Russians from the Kremlin to the most remote village. To be honest, it is unlikely anything can change this imperial and aggressive mindset until Russia suffers a defeat or the Russian dictatorship collapses. What we can do, however, is to build a solid wall to protect our countries from it. A new Iron Curtain, if you will, with Ukrainians and Estonians on the side of freedom this time. The old Iron Curtain served dictatorship and kept people away from freedom. To the contrary, the new Iron Curtain will protect free people from Russian dictatorship. It will not be made of concrete, but of the strengths of our armies and our decisions. Its bricks are acts of courage. You have one such act in front of you today, and we are counting on your leadership. Both of our nations know that the cost of freedom is high, but the cost of unfreedom is much higher. It is not enough to fight for freedom. We must defeat those who seek to destroy it. We must make them pay the cost, not us. And money is all they really care about in the Kremlin. Let us make them pay for all of the suffering they have caused us in the past and to prevent all of the suffering that they intend to cause us in the future. Together, we will win. Glory to Ukraine and Elago Esti.
Aitäh selle pöördumise eest Ukraina välisministrile.
Thank you for your speech, Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs Dmytro Kuleba. Now let's move on two people who we see on our screen. And the first one, I will give 10 minutes speech to Mr. Bill Browder, who is an expert on Russia and a political activist.
Thank you for.
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak before you. This is I have listened to the Dmytro Kuleba's speech, and I'm going to echo a number of the things he said. But before I do that, let me just say a couple of things. For those of you who don't know me, I and my colleague Sergei Magnitsky were the canary in the coal mine, to use an expression of what was yet to come from the Putin regime in Russia. Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer, was uncovered a massive government corruption scheme in Russia in 2008. He exposed it, and in retaliation, he was arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed in November of 2009. Since his murder, I've made it my mission to get justice for him. And one of the things which I discovered could be very painful to the Russian government was the freezing of assets, and freezing of assets of individuals in the Russian government who committed gross human rights abuses. That idea became something called the Magnitsky Act, named after Sergei Magnitsky. And as I went around the world to explain this, and to repeat some of the words of Dmytro Kuleba, I explained that the Russian government cares more about money and their own money than just about anything. And the Magnitsky Act, of freezing their assets, was some way that we could really put pain on the Putin regime for their crimes. And I started the campaign for the Magnitsky Act at a time when everyone said, it's impossible, you could never do that. And as I explained it to different lawmakers in different countries, people started to say, well, actually, this makes a lot of sense. Why would we sanction the whole country when we can just go after the individual's money? And I explained this in the United States, I explained this in Europe, I explained this in various other places. And the Magnitsky Act eventually passed in the United States in 2012. And it became, and it really hit Putin right between the eyes. It caused him great pain. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And then we knew we were onto something really big and important. And I'm really proud to say before you that the one of the next countries to pass the Magnitsky Act in the world was Estonia. Estonia quickly jumped on this bandwagon, and now we have 35 countries with Magnitsky Acts. Now, when the war started, when Putin launched his war of aggression in Ukraine, and I watched it on television like everybody else, I was horrified. And like everybody else, I wanted to do something. And as I looked at what I could do, and I said to myself, well, I've spent more than a decade running around the world, meeting with lawmakers, meeting with governments to explain to them about freezing assets. And after the war started, the West collectively froze more than 300 billion of Russian assets. I said to myself, it seems to me that I may be uniquely qualified to run around the world now and discuss seizing those assets. And so that's what I've been doing since the war started. And the conversations were pretty stilted at the very beginning. When I went to the United States and I went to here in London where I live and spoke to our governments in the EU, everybody said, no, that's impossible. We can't do that. That's never been done before. In the same way as I said that this is impossible, it can't be done when we talked about supplying tanks. But as the war has ground down and ground on, and as more people have died and more destruction has happened, as Putin has created in Ukraine, the more this concept has become a more accepted concept. And I'm pleased that I'm sitting here before you today, because now we're actually talking about the first law in Europe which would confiscate Russian assets. I'm pleased that the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, is now openly talking about Britain confiscating Russian assets. I'm happy that the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is now talking about confiscating Russian assets. I'm happy that Ursula von der Leyen is talking about confiscating Russian assets. And it feels to me like the political momentum has now reached a more favorable point. And I just want to repeat a couple of the points that Mr. Kuleba made in terms of approaching the counter arguments. One of the biggest counter arguments I'm now hearing a lot of is that somehow, and this is particularly true in Europe, where the lion's share of the assets are, is that it would somehow be make Europe an unattractive destination for foreign capital. And as a financier and somebody who spent my entire professional life before becoming an activist, I can say with 100% certainty that if the United States, the EU, the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, Switzerland, and of course Estonia, were to all collectively confiscate the assets of the Russian government, where else are people going to keep their money? Are they going to store their reserves in Iranian rials or Argentine pesos? I don't think so. I know for a fact that the only place that people can store their money are reserve currencies, and the reserve currencies, if all the reserve currency countries act together, then that won't be a problem. And most importantly, we're in a situation now where the money is drying up. The United States, which was supposed to deliver $63 billion to Ukraine, is still debating it because of a ugly political disagreement in Congress. In the EU, it was held up because of Hungary trying to stop it. And it seems to me that the more time goes on, the more Russia is going to find their small, narrow group of allies in different places, and the more important it's going to be to confiscate this money. And having worked on an international campaign to get 35 countries to do a Magnitsky Act, I know how it works, and symbolism is extremely important. And while Estonia is a small country, Estonia can be a very important leader here when it comes to these frozen assets. And so it would seem to me that Estonia can play a very outsized role in passing this law to give comfort, confidence for other countries to do the same thing. And it really will make all the difference if the West can confiscate this 300 billion. That could be the money, that would be the money that would help Ukraine defend themselves in a terrible situation. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Browder. So we will now take questions, and just as vabandust, minu viga. Aitäh, härra Browder.
Thank you, Mr. Browder. And now the questions in Estonian. Please remember this. And after speaking, there should be, please leave a couple of seconds of break to allow for translation delay. Mr. Poolamets, Mr. Browder knows the Russian system and its illegal methods. Now, if Estonia really does make this decision, we were speaking about 60, 70 million euros, there's a risk that Russia takes similar steps with regard to us. And our embassy is only being granted for 99 years. They could confiscate that in Moscow. Do you think there's a risk that Russia might immediately target those that take these steps? Thank you.
I think that there's a very real risk that Russia will retaliate in all respects, which is one of the reasons why most people who support the confiscation of assets don't want to do this by themselves. They want to do this collectively. Having said that, I think that the risk of them confiscating your embassy is kind of low, because the moment you start confiscating embassies, then all hell breaks loose, and then where does it go from there? I think that there's a bigger risk if there are any Estonian companies that have assets in Russia. Those assets will be confiscated, but I think there's a risk that would happen in any event, and so I wouldn't hesitate to pass this law and to confiscate these assets, because Estonia has a lot more on the line than losing their embassy. Estonia has on the line losing your sovereignty. If Russia continues and succeeds in their war on Ukraine and wins the war, Estonia is the next target. And so I think that this is an existential risk, and to the extent that you can lead and give confidence to the other countries that have a lot more than $70 million, that have $300 billion, and Ukraine can get that money, that could be the difference between the extinction of your country or not.
Aitäh.
Thank you. And a bit of clarification that we have spoken about confiscation many times in relation to the bill, but in fact we have siege in the bill. So we don't actually use the word confiscation, it's not precise. My question to Mr. Browder, when you talk about your plans around the world, how do you feel right now? If Estonia passed this act, what would be the impact be for the other countries who are discussing the same thing right now? Thank you.
It's an excellent question and an important question. And having been involved in, and maybe one of the very few people in the world who's been involved in this multi-country campaign for getting the same law passed everywhere with the Magnitsky Act, I can tell you that it would be very influential. That every time anyone is discussing and debating the law in Europe, in the United States, and the UK, the first line of the article is going to be that while the debate is going on, Estonia already went ahead and did it, and overcame these arguments, these obstacles that the naysayers have put up. And as I say, Estonia is a tiny country, but can play an outsized role in this situation. And if you were sort of sitting on the edge of Europe and you didn't have Russia as your direct neighbor, maybe I wouldn't recommend taking the risky position of being out front on this thing. But because you're right there and you're on the front line and you're next, I think that this is really one of the most important things you can do at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Vooglaid, you have a question. Thank you. First of all, you made a remark about the terminology, and I would like to say that as far as I know, it is in fact confiscation. The mechanism is meant to mask the fact that this is confiscation. Everyone understands that this is confiscation to all intents and purposes. But my question to Mr. Browder is, you are expressing quite forcefully that small Estonia should use the opportunity to be the first to make this step that might have very potentially long-lasting consequences before UK, before USA, before France, who is talking about deploying forces in Ukraine, and before all other great powers. But why do you think that, especially in light of the fact that Estonia, as a small country at the Russian border, could be subjected to much greater consequences than all these big countries that have better countermeasures at their disposal? wouldn't it be logical and much more in our interests if the USA would be the first to take this step, and the other great powers would follow their lead, who have more diplomatic and more military opportunities, options like UK, Germany, and others, and then the small countries would come after them? I feel that this is not in the interests of Estonia, this line of action. Thank you.
I can sympathize and understand your feelings. I mean, it's terrible to be sitting there on the border of Russia, with them breathing down your neck, with them threatening you, and having important Russian politicians basically discussing taking away your sovereignty. I can understand that. It's a terrible, terrible place to be, scary place to be. But unfortunately, as Dmytro Kuleba said, you can't pick up your country and move it someplace else. You are where you are, and you're, really are on the front line. This is not a place where you can. This is not a war that you can hide from. This is not a war that you can opt out of. You are on the front line, and so the real question is, can you do anything to change the equation? And you have done things to change the equation. You were, as was mentioned by the Ukrainian foreign minister, you provided javelins before the war started. So one could argue that that was provocative. You provided more military aid as a percentage of GDP than just about any other country. So one could argue that that's provocative. But you did those things. And this is a place where you can actually make a big difference in a global debate by being the first. And I can tell you for sure that the United States and the EU and the UK are not going to act before one another. They're going to act all in unison. And they're going to act in unison because the dollar is at risk if they do it before the euro, and the euro is at risk if they do it before the pound. But the one thing, by you acting before those people, I would argue, you seriously improve the probability of them acting, and increase the pace of their decision making, so it'll happen sooner. And this is something that will have there's no question that you acting and you becoming the bullet point in everybody's debates will make this much more likely to happen, that the Ukrainians will eventually get this $300 billion. And if they get this $300 billion, then the probability of you being invaded goes down. And so it's really it's not a pleasant place to be, and no one would want to be in your situation, but you are in your situation, and this is something you could do about it. Thank you.
Aitäh. Võtame
Thank you. And now 2 questions for Mr. Browder. There are also 2 people who want to ask questions. My question might be also addressed to other experts. I don't know if Bill knows anything about this, but we have talked about the US, UK, who at least have started to talk about seizing Russian assets. But as far as I know, Canada has a draft either in proceedings or already adopted. So can you say something about the Canadian Act?
Yes. So I was involved in the creation of the Canadian Act. So the Canadian Act is called the Foreign Asset or the Frozen Asset Repurposing Act. And this came as a direct consequence of the Canadian Magnitsky Act. And what it says is that if there are assets, individuals' assets that are frozen, and I say individuals, not the country of Russia, if they're frozen as a result of their Magnitsky Act or their other sanctions, then those assets will not just be frozen, but repurposed in terms of meaning confiscated. But they don't apply. This conversation does not apply to the sovereign assets of Russia. This law applies to individual oligarch assets, and I believe that there's now a test case with the assets that belong to Roman Abramovich, but it doesn't apply to the sovereign assets. And that's where the big money is. That's where the $300 billion is. And that's where the easiest legal argument is for confiscating the assets. It's a harder argument to confiscate individual people's assets because you have to prove that those individuals were connected in some way to the decision to launch the war. As far as the government is concerned, all you have to prove is that the assets belong to the government, which they do, because the government did launch the war. And so I think it's an easier, faster, cleaner confiscation on the government assets, which is what we're discussing here. The Canadians didn't do that; they did it on individuals.
aitäh, härra Sutt, palun.
Thank you, Mr. Sutt. Thank you. First of all, every NATO member state, doesn't matter whether we talk about Estonia, Finland, Sweden, or some other NATO member state, we shouldn't say that we are smaller than we are. And I think using frozen assets is correct. The only question is, what is the legally correct way to use them? And we should also not say that Russia is more important in world economy than they are. They're really a marginal force. And maybe you could repeat the reasons why you think that the use of frozen assets will not break down the international monetary system like some people fear. Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, the idea of confiscating money from a country that's waged war on another country is not a unique concept. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, Iraq paid reparations. After the Second World War, Germany paid reparations. It's an absolutely standard international legal concept that if a country does an invasion, they pay reparations. The only thing unique about this particular discussion is the timing of paying the reparations. Instead of saying we're waiting until the end of the war to pay the reparations, we're saying that the reparations should be paid right now. And why is this so important? Because we may be waiting for an end of a war that doesn't end. And furthermore, we may be in a situation where if the reparations are paid right now, then the war will end positively for Ukraine as opposed to negatively for Ukraine. And if we look at this situation, I think the World Bank calculated the damage, the financial damage done to Ukraine up until now, and it's around $450 billion. And of course, there are other estimates that are a lot higher than that. It's clear that Russia has created this enormous damage. It's clear that they're responsible for that damage. And it's also clear that we have custody of $300 billion, which goes away towards funding that responsibility. And one of the things which I think from a moral standpoint we should be thinking about is before the taxpayers of the UK, Europe, the United States, Canada, wherever should be paying for that, shouldn't Putin be paying for that? Why are his legal rights for protection of his money more important than the financial rights of the taxpayers of the rest of the world that are supporting Ukraine? I don't think that anyone can argue that Putin has more legal rights. I don't think anyone can argue that Putin hasn't done the damage. And so it's just a question of how do you collect money for the damages, and we have it right here and right now. And there are people on this panel far more qualified than me to talk about the legalities, and I think that Mr. Tribe will be talking about that, and Mr. Åslund and so on. But I don't think that there's any question that there's any legal liability here, and it's just a question of the mechanics of doing it.
aitäh, härra Browder, rohkem.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Browder. We won't accept any more questions for you, and I hand over the floor to Mr. Åslund for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. and honored member of RICOGO. Thank you for inviting me to speak today on this very important topic. I should say from the beginning that my views are very much in line with Minister Kuleba and Mr. Browder. And I want to congratulate you all for having launched this, because it's important to set a precedent, as Bill Browder just emphasized. And first of all, Ukraine has suffered enormously. The latest assessment of the damages is now $486 billion, according to the World Bank. And the collective West has long claimed that Russia must be held not only responsible, but also accountable, that it's paid for the damage it has caused. This must be done timely and in full. I think that the big concern now is timing. Ukraine needs about $100 billion a year to keep going in the war, $60 billion or so for military assistance, and $40 billion to cover the budget deficit, that is to keep the civilian government going. And if this does not happen, inflation would rise sharply. And this is what must be avoided. There are essentially two arguments against taking the Russian assets frozen in the West. One is legal, which I entirely leave to Professor Laurence Tribe, that we're happy to have on this panel, who's the leading international authority on the topic. And the other is the economic argument, which I will focus on. But I would start with the UN General Assembly resolution of the 14th of November 2022, which stated clearly that Russia must be held accountable and be compelled to pay war reparations to Ukraine. The wording of it is that Russia must, I quote, bear the legal consequences of all its international wrongful acts, including making reparation for the injury, including any damage caused by such acts. This was adopted by a substantial majority in the UN General Assembly. In practice, the G7 has taken the lead in Western policy making on financial support. And on February 24th, the G7's latest statement ran, I quote, "It is not right for Russia to decide if or when it will pay for the damage it has caused in Ukraine. Russia's obligations under international law to pay for the damage it is causing are clear. We are determined to dispel any false notion that time is on Russia's side, that destroying infrastructure and livelihoods has no consequences for Russia, or that Russia could prevail by causing Ukraine to fail economically. Russia should not be able to indefinitely delay payment it owes. We recognize the urgency of disrupting Russia's attempt to destroy the Ukrainian economy and Russia's continued failure to abide by its international law obligations. We are determined to ensure full accountability, and we support Ukraine in obtaining compensation for the loss, injury, and damage resulting from Russia's aggression. So the question that we have here today is not if Russia should be forced to pay, but how. Bill Browder has already explained that war reparations are standard, and after Iraq's assault on Kuwait in 1990, Iraq was forced to pay $52.4 billion in war reparations, and it paid it all in full, completing it 2 years ago. And as Bill Browder also mentioned now, there is a wonderful opportunity how to force Russia to pay. that the G7 has immobilized the currency reserves of the Russian central bank in the West. They amount to some $205 billion, of which about $200 billion sit in Euroclear in Brussels, a private for-profit financial settlement company, which is now strongly against seizing Russian assets. You can imagine why. Euroclear made billions of dollars each year in interest on the Russian reserves. So of course they are against it. This is a kind of interest that should not be accepted. So I continue with what the G7 are stated. Consistent with our respective legal systems, Russian sovereign assets in our jurisdictions will remain immobilized until Russia pays for the damage it's caused to know. And they intend to take further action at the summit in June 2024. But this is not enough. Within the G7, Canada has already adopted legislation for the confiscation of Russian assets. And recently, the United Kingdom has strongly called for the confiscation of Russian sovereign assets. Within the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen and Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis has spoken up strongly for seizing the Russian assets. The US Congress appears to have a bipartisan majority for confiscation of Russian assets. I use the word here intentionally, while Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is hesitant and talks about just using the returns of it. There's no reason for that. Japan appears to be on the side of Canada and the UK, while Germany, France, and Italy have expressed doubts, leaning on the European Central Bank. And these are the concerns that I want to dismiss. The main economic argument, as mentioned by Bill Browder, is that it might cause financial destabilization. Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, is the main proponent of this argument. She claims that the euro would be undermined because foreigners would refuse to keep money in euro. But this argument is flawed in every regard, and she has not offered any substantial elaboration of it. First of all, the Russian central bank reserves have been immobilized for 2 years already, and no stabilization or flight from Western currencies took place. Second, a reserve currency has to be stable, convertible, and based on a large, free, open economy with good rule of law. Therefore, there are only two credible and willing reserve currencies, the US dollar and the euro, which steadily account for about 80% of global currency reserves. It takes a long time to change reserve currency. It took half a century for the dollar to replace the pound sterling in the last century. And that was, it only happened when Britain did whatever it could to no longer be a reserve currency. Currently, US dollars account for 59% of all reserve currencies, and the euro for 20%. Next comes the Japanese yen and British pound, sterling for 5% each, Canadian dollars and Australian dollars for 2% each. Chinese yuan is only 2.4% of all global reserves, essentially because Russia keeps it for political reasons, and other currencies are significant. So all these emerging market currencies do not have sufficient conditions for being reserve currencies, and smaller countries than the US and the Eurozone don't want to be held as reserve currencies, because that would mean that their exchange rate becomes too high so that they can't sell goods and services. And finally, the West should not aim at holding money of kleptocracies or authoritarian states. Which are the countries we are talking about? It's the Gulf states and China. They have nowhere else to go with the money. So this idea that Christine Lagarde pushes and a particular Berlin listens to is empty. So I think that to conclude that it's very good, as Bill Browder argued, that Estonia sets a precedent. I think that the rest will follow. The European Commission is strongly on this line. So is 80% of the European Parliament. And we have these laggards, Germany, France, and Italy, that have not understood much of the war in policy of Russia and Ukraine, that Estonia has understood so well. I've written several books about post-communist transformation, Russia and Ukraine, and throughout my writing, Estonia is the leading star. You are not worse at thinking or setting precedents because you're small. As Bill Browder emphasized, in the Magnitsky law case, the small countries showed that they could take the lead. Remember, by the way, that Lithuania was first recognized as an independent state by Iceland, one of the very small states that could stand up for the right causes. In the same way, we are now seeing that Estonia is standing up for right causes in many cases. Don't hesitate, do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Åslund. So we have time for questions. Härra Vooglaid, palun.
Mr. Vooglaid has a question. Thank you. First of all, it's not surprising that Mr. Åslund said in your presentation that your opinions are the same as Mr. Kuleba's and Mr. Browder's. We all understand that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has chosen the experts who all express the same opinion, which is a different problematic question, because this is not an honest way to use experts. We know that in West we have great number of experts in financial systems, in law, and who are very skeptical about this affair. But what really disturbs me in this whole situation is that we keep hearing how 3 experts in a row say the same thing, keep saying, little Estonia, go before others, and let's see afterwards whether the others follow you. I think that from the point of view of Estonian interests, it's not sufficient for some experts to think that others will follow. We need guarantees because it would not make sense from our point of view if the Western countries work together, because we keep hearing talk about Western unity, but suddenly nobody wants to talk about unity, but you say, oh, Estonia, you go first into the lion's den, and then depending on what happens to you, we will see whether we follow. I think this is an embarrassing thing to listen to. And my question specifically is, you come here to the Estonian parliament to tell us to go first, but why don't you say that in your own parliament? Why don't you go to, for example, to the Swedish parliament and tell them to go first? How have you explained it to Sweden, which is much more capable militarily, much richer, and has a much better position? Why shouldn't Sweden be the first to go? What would be the reasons? would one reason be that in the Swedish legal culture, it's not acceptable to confiscate someone's assets without paying just compensation for it? Or is the reason because in Sweden, people understand that Russia would adopt quite serious countermeasures against Sweden? Please explain that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Well, an obvious reason is that Sweden has been completely preoccupied with two issues: providing sufficient military support for Ukraine, and as you might be aware, Sweden just delivered a package of $700 million of military aid to Ukraine. Sweden has a very substantial arms industry. I come from Karlskoga, where you have the main military industrial company, so I know a little bit about that. And the other issue, which has been all dominant, has been to join NATO. And we are now seeing that Sweden has finally managed to become a member of NATO. I will raise this question in Sweden now, and it's a good point. But there is another issue, that is there are hardly any Russian assets in Sweden, because Sweden has for a long time had very restrictive anti-money laundering rules, while Estonia has some assets. Canada has very few. I heard Chrystia Freeland in Davos in January, and she said that we have not managed to find almost any Russian asset in Canada. They have the legislation, but there's very little to apply it to. So I agree with you, Sweden should go for it, and I will push for it in Sweden. As I see it, the G7 should take a decision on this at its summit in June. So what should happen now is that it's really tilted in the right direction. As I see the European politics, we have a big problem in Berlin, where we have a very indecisive chancellor who says one thing and then doesn't do anything time and time again. France has basically come over on the right side. President Macron says the right thing, but Minister of Finance Bruno Le Maire recently said something restrictive on this issue. The Italian Minister of Finance also. And the striking thing, you ask for the arguments. These people don't have any arguments. The two standard arguments are as short as this. This is against international law, which I entirely leave to Professor Tribe, who's the top expert on this issue. I'm not aware of anybody who contests him on these matters. And the other is that it could destabilize the economies, as I just focused on in my statement. This is a complete nonsense. It's not a substantial argument. And the people who do it, in particular Christine Lagarde, there's nothing to say behind it. And then we should ask not who says it, but what are their arguments. Thank you.
Aitäh, härra Sutt, palun.
Thank you, Mr. Sutt. Thank you. You are an expert on Russian economy and Russian government, and you just said that the claim that the use of these assets would highly damage the international financial system are completely wrong. But could you just say in how big dependency the other countries around the world are of Russian economy?
Extremely little is the answer, but it's a good question. Think of it that the Russian economy is only $2 trillion. The European and the US economies together are a bit more than $40 trillion. The Russian economy is just a couple of percent of a few percent of the Western economies. I thought you would pose another question, that is, what would be the impact on the Russian economy be? Essentially, Russia has lost its reserves. To begin with, it had about $600 billion of reserves. Here, half of it is frozen, and the other, almost half, is in non-liquid assets. Chinese yuan, a bit more than $100 billion. Gold, $135 billion. IMF, special drawing rights, $30 billion. And this leaves Russia with very few reserves. So the effective consequence of this is that Russia cannot utilize any free resources that it has saved, but it will not cause an economic crisis. It simply means that Russia cannot spend more than 10% of GDP on its military, and that while a country that is in full war, as Ukraine, spends 22% of GDP on the military, because Ukraine has the Western support that can provide these resources. So by and large, we can ignore it. And again, I praise the three Baltic states and Poland that had most trade with Russia, that they have accepted to have that a cut-off, because that has been a significant cost for the Baltic countries and Poland.
Aitäh.
Thank you. I have a question. The assets have already been frozen, which means that Russia cannot use these. But what additional impact would it have if we confiscate these or seize these and give to Ukraine, not from the point of view of rebuilding Ukraine, but from the point of view of Russian economy? What would be the additional impact on the Russian economy? Thank you.
Sorry, that was what I just responded to. It means that Russia cannot utilize these any reserves for its armament. It would not have any direct effect. So you should not use this as an argument for causing an economic crisis in Russia. The big thing when it comes to finances for the Russian economy is the financial sanctions from 2014, which means that Russia's foreign indebtedness has fallen in the course of a decade from $720 billion to $360 billion by half. So Russia has simply fewer financial resources available. But the big issue is that Ukraine will be in a financial crisis without getting more financial resources soon.
Täpsustan natukene oma küsimust.
I will clarify my question a bit. How Russia right now can use the frozen assets which have not been confiscated? You said they can use these as reserve. How does that work?
Yeah, sorry, of course, right. Russia cannot use these reserves now. But if you look up on the Russian Central Bank website, currently the Russian Central Bank reserves are at $550 billion officially. So the Russians still include these reserves in their official accounts. They have not written them off or even made any particular reservation. So clearly they think that the G7 will give in at some time. And therefore it's so important that you act now to say, no, we are not going that way. As I see it, the global Western opinion is now ready to do this, but it needs to happen. We have waited for it now for 1 year. I heard Ursula von der Leyen speaking in London in June last year, essentially saying that we should make Russia accountable and force Russia to pay without specification. And then she got the lawyers in the European Commission against her for no good reason. And then she couldn't go ahead and act. So therefore, it needs to be others. I don't see any arguments of substance for these people who say, no, we can't do such things. There are so many people who just say, don't rock the boat, let us stick to our old inertia. These are not arguments, these are lack of thinking.
Aitäh selle vastuse eest.
Thank you for your answer. I understood that the important thing here is that if we give them to Ukraine, it shows to Russia that they will not be able to use these reserves, which they still think they have. Mr. Kross. Thank you. A bit of a detour from today's topic. In addition to Russian reserve, which have been frozen in the West, what else could and should the Ramstein Convention do, the EU and the US, to limit the resources of the Russian war machine? Is it the export of oil, which I think is the main source of income, despite the price ceiling, which doesn't seem to function very well because India and China keep buying it? Or are there any other things, some restrictions that we haven't made that we should make?
Thank you. I think that you're exactly right. It's Russian oil and gas that are the important thing. With regard to gas, it was essentially cut off last year. Russia's exports last year fell by 29%, which is very substantial. And oil and gas traditionally account for almost 2/3 of Russia's total exports when the prices are high. At present, there is ample oil on the global market. There is a surplus of gas. I think that the big thing that should be done is to blockade all Russian oil and gas. And the West has now big opportunities to impose secondary sanctions, as the US has done for many years and is now doing on a big scale. Traditionally, the EU has opposed Russian secondary sanctions. In the last couple of years, the EU has stopped doing so and is doing so itself. So I see that we have a good situation where we can reduce Russia's export revenues. And I think that should be the central thing, rather than taking one commodity after the other. One can also do what my colleague at the Stockholm School of Economics, Torbjörn Becker, has argued: prohibit all Russian exports and then give the concessions for those exports that are absolutely vital to the West. It could be administratively an easier system than the current system, that very many Russian exports are sanctioned while others are not, which is becoming a jungle. You want to be on one side. Either everything is white or everything is black. Make everything black. Prohibit all Russian exports and then go after it. But the central thing is now oil.
Aitäh, meil on veel üks viimane lühike.
Thank you. We have one last short question from Mr. Vooglaid. Yes, thank you. In relation to your answer to my previous question, if I remember correctly, you mainly mentioned two arguments why Sweden hasn't acted first. You said that Sweden has already given a lot to Ukraine in military aid. I looked at the Kiel Institute for the Economy webpage. Estonia's data is since 2015 4th of February 2022, 3.6% of the GDP, Sweden 0.5%. So it's a 7 times difference. So in absolute numbers, of course, it's different, but I don't think your argument is correct here. And you said also that in Sweden there are not a lot of Swedish assets. We also don't have a lot of these in Estonia, 40 millions, which is a very small percentage. And another second question, as you understand, is not a question how many assets we have located here, it's the question of principle. And in connection with this, I ask you what Sweden itself has in real life done in the direction where you want to push Estonia, and whether the Swedish parliament has initiated a draft act in the same vein as you want Estonia to pass. Thank you.
Thank you. Good point. On the first, of course, Estonia is the leader. What I refer to is the new Swedish commitment, which is much bigger, which is not as yet included in the Kiel Ukraine tracker. But of course, Estonia is the leader in this regard, and I've praised Estonia all the time for this. What I mentioned is that it has not become an issue in Sweden because there is so little. In Estonia, fortunately, it is an issue, and I would like to raise it more in Sweden now, when the massive attention to the NATO accession has passed. But as Estonia, the current Swedish government is strongly and ever more in favor of Ukraine. So this should be raised. I get inspired by your words to write an op-ed article in one of the Swedish newspapers about this, because it's important that Sweden also participates in setting a standard. And as we speak about it, I think that the Baltic countries and the Nordic countries, now all nearly all in the EU and all in NATO, are closer to one another than ever. And I might point out that it's Sweden and Finland that are following the Baltic countries rather than the other way around. So you are the leaders, and that's something that I'm happy to concede to you.
Aitäh, härra Åslund. Liigume edasi järgmise esineja juurde.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Åslund. And now we go to the next presenter. I'm sorry, I don't know how exactly to pronounce this. Keatinge.
You're
Mr. Keatinge.
You're exactly right. The E is there to confuse people, but not to be pronounced.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to have this opportunity. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint some people in the room, because I will echo some of the points that have been made by Mr. Browder and Mr. Åslund, but I would like to offer to convene either here in Brussels, where I am talking to you from, or from London, any meeting of any people that have practical ideas to drive forward the importance of confiscating the immobilized assets of the Russian central bank. As Mr. Browder mentioned, we have a positive attitude from our foreign secretary in the UK, and I would hope that we are very close to the point where not just Estonia would need to lead, but where Ukraine's allies will lead forward on this point. By way of background, I spent 20 years as an investment banker at JP Morgan. In my final year at JP Morgan, which was in 2013-2014, I was JP Morgan's client relationship manager for the Central Bank of Russia. And I want to tell a short story that I would also like to tell to Christine Lagarde on this question of the way in which taking action against immobilized assets might undermine trust in the euro. In that year, we had a project at JP Morgan to try and raise the international demand for the Chinese RMB, for assets denominated in Chinese RMB. To do that, we visited many central banks around the world and we said, look, you've got lots of dollar assets, you've got lots of euro assets. Why don't you sell a few of those assets and buy Chinese RMB assets instead, issued by people like the European Investment Bank or other AAA rated entities? Why don't you do that? We said. I can report that at the end of 1 year of effort, we had successfully encouraged central banks to trade more out of euros and dollars into the Swedish krona than into the Chinese RMB. The point is that, as the others have mentioned, the dollar and the euro represent secure stores of value, trustworthy stores of value, liquid stores of value, unless you are planning to mount an illegal evasion on a neighboring country. And so I do think that this argument about market stability really needs to be put to bed. It needs to be put to bed because it's simply not true. As the others have mentioned, the moment of perhaps peak potential market instability was in March 2022, when the assets were originally immobilized. After that point, the Russian assets were beyond the reach of the Russian state. That's the point when there would have been volatility. The second thing I would say is that even if there were to be volatility, and of course we wouldn't wish that, but even if there were to be volatility, think back to the global financial crisis in 2008. Think back to the following euro sovereign debt crisis. There are instruments in Europe for combating and dealing with that form of volatility. I wouldn't want us to have to use them, but the point is that we do know how to deal with that volatility. What I would like to see, and to some extent this echoes something of what a colleague was saying in an early question to Mr. Åslund, is I would like to see more leadership. Obviously, I would like to see more leadership from the European Central Bank. I would like to see more leadership from individual countries, but I'd also like to see more leadership from the so-called masters of the universe, the CEOs of the big banks with the big balance sheets that are in a position to provide the liquidity and deal with instability in markets when it comes along. By the way, they make a lot of money out of that instability, so they should want to do it. So, for example, I was very disappointed to see some of the quite weak words reported. I didn't have the opportunity, like Mr. Åslund, to attend Davos, but reported words coming out of some senior bankers at Davos expressing concerns about the weaponization of reserves, about mistrust in the potential mistrust in the euro and the dollar. So I would want to strongly endorse the points made by others, but I'd want to endorse them not just from the point of view it's the right thing to do, and it absolutely, of course, is the right thing to do, because we don't just want to help Ukraine survive, which I sometimes fear is the attitude of some Western leaders these days. We want to make sure Ukraine wins, and we want to make sure they win in as short a time as it takes, not as long as it takes, as many leaders say. So that's a clearly very important point, and I would endorse that. But the other thing I think we have to be aware of is that we do see, unfortunately, that we start to see a lack of financial commitment in some countries around the world to supporting Ukraine. And what we cannot afford is for people to start raising an argument that says, well, there's 300 billion euros or whatever the number is of Russian central bank assets available. Why aren't we using those? Why are we using our own taxpayers' money? So I think there's also a signaling issue here to our citizens who may, I'm not saying that's necessarily happening yet, but may start questioning why is our money being spent on supporting Ukraine when there is Russian money lying there that is freely available. On the legal arguments, everyone has given great deference to Professor Tribe, and I won't talk across that. All I would say is that I would draw your attention in the Parliament there to what I thought is an excellent summary of the current status of consideration on that topic that was produced, I think, just last week by the European Parliamentary Research Service. It debunks all the concerns, the legal concerns people might have, which I'm sure Professor Tribe will go into in much more detail. But if you want a succinct summary from the perspective of the EU, or at least from the European Parliament, then that research service paper is to be recommended. The only other thing I would want to raise is I was asked also to speak about the oligarch assets, the private assets. So the first thing I would want to say about that is it's very important that we distinguish between the central bank assets and the assets of private individuals that have been frozen in the form of yachts, bank accounts, properties, and so forth. And I think too often these two issues get conflated. So we need to, when we're talking about the central bank assets, we need to make sure that we are talking specifically about the central bank assets, and we don't allow some of the arguments that are made on the question of oligarch and other assets muddy that particular picture. Now, I would argue that is a more challenging argument to have, because we very quickly get into the question of the rights to property ownership and all the rest of it. I think there are solutions out there, but I don't think that we've necessarily found the right way to approach these. Obviously, I think there was some reference to what has happened in Canada that Mr. Browder and others have been involved with. That I don't think has yet really been tested in the courts. There have been discussions about, are there routes for donation that the UK Foreign Office suggested in a press release last June. And obviously, there are opportunities to confiscate assets should individuals try to evade sanctions and trigger money laundering regulations or others, as we've seen happen in the United States with a small transfer made to the benefit of Ukraine of about $5.4 million. But the big prize and the low-hanging fruit and the urgent prize that we need to monetize is clearly the immobilized central bank assets. I will stop there. I'm happy to take questions. I don't want to be an echo of what Mr. Browder and Mr. Åslund have said, but I look forward to the questions.
Aitäh teile selle ülevaate eest, proua Tiidus, palun.
Thank you for the overview, Mrs. Tiidus.
European sanctions and illicit finance, monitoring and analyzing network, ma ei hakka seda eesti keelde tõlkima, SIFMANet on andnud soovitused 2024. aastaks ehk selleks.
The recommendations are for 2024 from this center, how to enforce the sanctions. And one of the recommendations is that we must establish an interstate agency that is responsible for the entire process. I found this from the address that was flashing in your background, SIFMANet, to have some interstate agency.
Well, thank you for spotting that. So yeah, the SIFMANet is a network of research institutions that we run at RUSI. We made a visit to Estonia actually last year at some point, and we assessed the way in which EU member states are dealing with the challenge of implementing these huge amounts of sanctions. And one of the issues that comes up very regularly, both on a country level but also within the EU, is just how many different agencies and organizations are involved in implementing sanctions. We lose a lot of time having to coordinate, left hand not knowing what right hand is doing. And I think what we should recognize is that since February 2022, EU member states and the EU in general has moved a long way from its traditional way of thinking about sanctions. Traditionally, the EU thought about sanctions as an MFA-led tool, as a messaging tool, sending messages of disapproval in relation to human rights, in relation to what's happening in war zones, whatever it might be. And that was an important tool. But it's in the last 2 years, sanctions in the EU have gone from being almost exclusively a messaging tool to, importantly, not only a messaging tool, but also a tool of action, of freezing assets, of blocking trade, of taking all the measures necessary to restrict, to the greatest extent possible, the resourcing and the funding of the Russian military. And if you're going to turn to action, that is going to involve many more agencies, border agencies, transport agents, departments, trade departments, financial services, obviously. And so we need to find a way of better coordinating, better integrating the way we operate. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm in Brussels these 2 days, and I need a new pair of shoes every time I leave Brussels because I have to run between so many different people in order to put together the picture of what is actually happening at an EU level on sanctions. So I think there is an argument to learn the lessons of the last 2 years and to create some sort of better harmonization and integration in the way we use sanctions. I would also argue that that would fit with this greater focus that the EU is taking on the whole question of economic security as well.
aitäh, kas härra, hea küll, härra Kross, palun.
Mr. Kross. Thank you. This question might be geared towards the next speaker, but since you mentioned the legal difference between the Russian Federation assets and the individual oligarch assets, then in our discussions, we've also covered this topic. Last week, I was in the legal committee of EMPA, where the same matters were being discussed. And now there's a recommendation to use Russian oligarchs' assets in freezing their assets. The recommendation is to use the RICO type of legislation. So since Russian Federation regime is a terrorist regime, declared so by all big institutions in the West, then the responsibility, the liability would lie on them, and they need to prove that their assets are not of a criminal origin. So what do you think of such a mechanism?
Well, as you say, I think Professor Tribe will eat me alive on this topic, given his experience and expertise. But I would like to perhaps share one experience from the United Kingdom. The first thing I should say in all of this is that many countries, and where I live, the UK, is an unfortunate prime example of this. Many countries ignored the oligarch asset issue for far, far too long. We welcomed those assets, and now we realize that actually that was an error. It is not for nothing that the capital city of the United Kingdom is known in many news outlets, particularly news outlets outside the UK, as Londongrad. I would like to point you to one bit of legislation in the UK, which is what we call in the UK unexplained wealth orders. Unexplained wealth orders were introduced in 2017. They were revised last year, and they are, in short, a reverse burden of proof tool that allows the National Crime Agency and other law enforcement agencies in the UK to essentially say to somebody, we don't quite understand how you own that £15 million house in London. Please explain to us how you own that and where that wealth comes from. And if they're unable to do so, then you enter a potential confiscation process. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, and these orders have been used rarely and not very effectively so far. But Australia has a similar power, and Ireland likewise. So I think this kind of creative thinking about legal mechanisms without, I think we'd all agree, throwing the rule of law out of the window, which we obviously hold to dearly, even though our adversary does not. I think this kind of creative thinking is something that we should be developing, because ultimately, I think most countries at the moment find, when it comes to oligarch assets and confiscating those assets for the benefit of Ukraine, they find themselves at something of an impasse.
aitäh, härra Tribe, kas te soovite lisada, et küsimus oli?
Thank you, Mr. Tribe. Would you like to respond as well, because the question was partially geared to you as well? Mr. Tribe, would you like to respond as well to this previous question?
I'd be glad to. In the United States, the idea of shifting the burden of proof on the basis that someone is affiliated with a terrorist organization or a racketeering organization is quite unsettled. There are legal experts who believe that it would deprive individuals of property without due process of law to treat what appears to be their assets as automatically the fruits of a criminal enterprise, simply because that individual is associated with an enterprise that has illegality at its core. And in America, it's quite clear that the difficulties of convincing courts that it is permissible to seize an individual's assets on the basis of that shifted burden of proof are enormous, and that the yield of doing so is much lower than the yield of seizing assets that indisputably belong to a terrorist state, or that belong to indeed any sovereign state, because under American constitutional law, states do not have constitutional rights of the sort that private individuals have. That's one reason, simply to anticipate a question that someone might ask me after I make a few prepared remarks when it's my turn. That's one reason that I think it is much more fruitful for nations in the West to proceed against the sovereign assets of Russia's central bank than to engage in what could be years, if not decades, of legal struggle over the seizure of private oligarch assets. The need is for the money now, not years from now. And that very much points to emphasizing the sovereign assets as opposed to the private assets.
aitäh teile ja võtame veel ühe küsimuse.
Thank you. And one more question for Mr. Keatinge from Mr. Vooglaid. Thank you very much. Let's put it this way. I most certainly am not an expert of the financial system, unlike you, and therefore my comments are not as expert as yours. But in my comments, I rely on the statements of other experts that I have read when I was reading up on the matter. And I'm slightly surprised that in your statement, you demonstrated the potential threat to the international monetary system as so limited, because I've seen different opinions where it's stated that the issue is what will be the far-fetching impact of this project on the credibility of the international financial system and its stability in the long term and preserving it. We understand that there are basically two tiers here. The first is the practical tier, where the main issue is how we could penalize Russia right now by confiscating the frozen assets and use them to support Ukraine and for the recovery of the state or for military action. But the main issue is about whether the international financial system can be trusted by different states and corporations. So if you participate in the financial system and you place your assets in this financial system, is it beyond doubt that without a court decision, nobody's assets will be stripped? And of course, in case of states, there's the sovereign right, and that there is no authority who could make this decision regarding them. And the issue is not only about Russia, it's about all countries of the world, including China, BRIC countries, Arab countries, who export a lot of oil, and countries that have a considerable role in the global economy and participate heavily in the Western financial system. And in the end, it makes me think about what Mr. Browder also said, that currently we don't need to be very fearful because there is no alternative financial system that they could rely on in their relations. But isn't that one of the potential risks here, that they think that the current financial system can be pushed aside and they will establish a parallel financial system that could also mean the end of this dollar-based reserve system? So aren't these considerations we should take into account in analyzing the whole issue? Thank you.
So at the core of your question is trust in use of the US dollar or the euro. Now, whether or not the assets of the Central Bank of Russia are confiscated for the benefit of Ukraine, and I'm not going to rehearse what Mr. Åslund, I mean, I think from a kind of UN and international perspective, this is not something that would be unsurprising. I think it's reasonably well supported. But sanctions, particularly by the United States, have been used for many decades, and people have for those many decades said, well, the more you use sanctions, the more you'll drive people to use other currencies away from the US dollar, away from the euro, and so on. And yes, of course, you see people coming up with financial structures that try to avoid the long arm of the United States. So you see trade in other currencies, you see barter trade. Increasingly, you might see trade in central bank digital currencies or whatever it might be. So that is going to happen, regardless of what we do with the Russian central bank assets. That is going to happen. It's not happening very quickly. It's somewhat imperceptible at the rate that it's happening. And one of the reasons for that is very simply because people still feel that the US dollar and the euro are the safest stores of value. Now, you could argue, yes, but if you confiscate the central bank's assets, you're eroding that belief in safety. But I come back to a point I made earlier on, which is unless you are planning on mounting an illegal invasion of your neighbor, then you shouldn't have any concern about your reserves. Put differently, if you are planning on mounting an illegal invasion of your neighbor, then perhaps the future of your reserves might give you pause for thought. We'll never know if the Kremlin suspected that their central bank assets would be immobilized. I suspect they didn't. It was almost a unique move, certainly unique on the scale at which it was done. I don't dismiss the risks. What I said also earlier on was that even if those risks emerge, particularly as relates to market stabilization and volatility, we have mechanisms for dealing with that. And I would like to see those that know about those mechanisms speaking up and clarifying that those mechanisms stand ready to deal with volatility rather than to seemingly wish the volatility on us in order to prove their point.
Aitäh. Väga lühike kommentaar, et me oleme ajaga natuke edasi peal. Yeah.
Thank you. Very short comment since we're short on time. Yes, thank you for your reply. But I think that the main problem regarding my question is that when states see that the Western financial system has become a system that is controlled politically, that there are different principles applied to different countries, and for political interest, different treatment is applied to different countries to confiscate assets, then this will undermine confidence. And if there is a general principle and states know that if you don't attack another country, then your assets will not be at risk, then I think we can retain confidence. But in a situation where we see that, for example, in 2003, the US, UK, and Estonia with them participated in a massive aggression against Iraq, but their assets were not frozen nor confiscated, and nobody spoke about using these funds to for the recovery of Iraq. So that's not happening. But on the other side, it happens. So if we apply different standards, then it's natural that the countries participating in the system will say that we don't trust the system anymore and will establish an alternative system. Thank you. Thank you to Mr. Keatinge, and we will continue with the next speaker. And I'd like to pass the floor to Professor Tribe.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be testifying in this hearing of the Constitutional Committee of Estonia's Parliament. I'm here not as a partisan advocate of any particular point of view, but as an expert in the law. But I have to say, I'm also here as an admirer of your nation. Just a few days ago, on February 24th, you celebrated the birth of your independence, your declaration of liberty from a Soviet tyranny dating to 1919. But that same day was a date of infamy around the world because it marked 2 years to the day since Russia's launch of an all-out invasion of Ukraine, beginning a grotesque and illegal war whose consequences continue to mount. The question that I want to address is not the horror of that war, but the question of who should bear its costs. Under international law, it is entirely clear that Russia should bear, and indeed has an obligation to bear, the costs of its illegal aggression against a neighbor. The question of what is permissible under international law is sometimes difficult, but in this instance, it really isn't. As Mr. Keatinge pointed out, the European Parliament Research Service summarized the views of essentially all experts on the matter in saying that the confiscation of the frozen assets of the aggressor is entirely permissible. I spent over 6 months writing what amounted to a 200-page report for the Renew Democracy Initiative last year, reaching a similar conclusion, and also explaining that under the domestic law of the United States, such seizure and transfer of the frozen assets is already permissible, even without new legislation. And just 2 days ago, Harold Coe, one of the world's most renowned international law scholars, explained in the European Journal of International Law that under existing principles, there is no legitimate doubt about the legality of liquidating and then transferring the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. I'm not going to spend time on the universal agreement, universal except, of course, for Russia and its immediate allies, agreement with the proposition that Russia's aggression against Ukraine was unlawful. What I want to focus on is the question of what international law permits nations like Estonia, the United States, the nations of the EU, Japan, other nations to do about it. The consensus is that all nations are permitted to impose countermeasures to pressure Russia into ceasing its unlawful invasion. Those countermeasures must be reversible and they must be proportionate. And it is clear that temporarily suspending any applicable Russian sovereign immunity to permit the timely transfer of blocked Russian assets to Ukraine is an appropriate countermeasure under international law. It is, as I will explain, both reversible and directly proportional to Russia's legal violations. Conservatively and in purely economic terms, setting aside the incalculable human cost, the flagrantly illegal Russian invasion has caused at least $480 billion in direct damage to Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure, so that even if one were to account only for the narrow economic damage done by Russia, the transfer of the blocked $350 billion or so in Russian assets located in various countries around the world cannot possibly be deemed disproportionate. Indeed, Russia's separate obligation under settled principles of international law to compensate Ukraine fully for the damage it has wrought already makes clear that using the blocked Russian assets as a partial down payment on its obligation is both closely intertwined with Russia's continuing violations of international law and narrowly tailored to the rectification of the wrongs Russia has committed. Use of those blocked Russian assets is also fully reversible. As soon as Russia complies with its international legal obligations, Estonia and other nations can resume honoring Russia's immunity and stop transferring its frozen assets. But because Russia remains in violation of its obligations, unless and until it has fully compensated Ukraine for the damage it has done, that day will not come until Russia pays at least $480 billion to Ukraine. All transferred assets can count as a partial prepayment of that obligation and credited against whatever Russia continues to owe to Ukraine, so that makes any transfer fully reversible. But I would emphasize that even if it were not fully reversible, the International Law Commission's draft articles only require that countermeasures be reversible as far as possible. So the law is clear. Estonia has the right, as do all other nations, to temporarily waive Russian sovereign immunity and transfer to Ukraine the Russian assets that have been frozen. So the question is not, is Estonia within its rights, or are other nations within their rights in taking the frozen assets, seizing them and transferring them to Ukraine? The question is, should we do so? You might say it's easy for me to say, not sitting on Russia's border, to say that, yes, Estonia should take that step, because I've heard throughout today's testimony the argument, but we are at risk. We are a small nation. Why don't you move first? You can rest assured that I have urged our president that we should take the first step. But whether we do or not, the question of whether collectively all freedom-loving nations should act is the question on the table. To be sure, no nation that seizes and transfers Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine can say with certainty nothing will happen in retaliation. But that's the wrong question. If we do not take that action, we can say with increasing certainty that Russia will have been rewarded for its violations. and that nations like Estonia, which are in Russia's sights, are at greater risk. This is an existential question. The idea of worrying about the possible retaliation against one or another embassy when your entire sovereignty is at risk seems to me to miss the central point. And the time to act is now, not at some indefinite date when reparations will be exacted from Russia, the aggressor, because in that time, Ukraine will be utterly overrun. We need now to do more than our respective nations can do by burdening their own taxpayers. Estonia, the United States, and the other nations in the Western Alliance have already stretched their taxpayers as far as some of them are willing to go. The question is, why not reach for the low-hanging fruit? These vast sums of money, which are now remaining idle, which are not available for use by Russia, are indeed available for use by Ukraine. We have already taken, and Estonia has already taken, by freezing Russia's assets, a step that arguably attacks Russia's sovereignty. If Russia has not retaliated against those steps, what makes one think that suddenly Russia will retaliate against the further step of making use of these assets? The way I put it in the report that I wrote for the Renew Democracy Initiative, we have already put our foot into the Rubicon. Why not cross it? All of the half measures that some people propose, borrowing money on these frozen assets or seizing the profits derived from them and using those profits under our taxing authorities to help fund Ukraine, are equally attacks on Russia's sovereignty. What makes those attacks lawful under international law is that they are proportionate and reversible countermeasures designed to induce Russia to comply with its international obligations. If what we have already done and what Estonia has already done is consistent with international law, then taking the further step of making these assets available to Ukraine does not violate any discrete or distinct international legal principle. I'd be happy, given the limits of time, not to read anything more in my prepared statement, but simply to respond to your questions. But I say to you today that the courage you have already shown is admirable. The further courage of playing a role out of proportion to the few dollars, the relatively few dollars that have been frozen in Estonia, would be a step for which history would honor you. I would welcome your questions.
Aitäh, härra professor Tribe, selle põhjaliku
Thank you,
ülevaate.
Professor Tribe, for your overview. And first question from Mr. Sutt. Thank you. I also would like to thank you for a very clear and thorough overview. And I believe, like you said, we need to put things in perspective. And none of us in the free world should be thinking how much assets we have in Russia that they might confiscate. That is not the focus. That's not the essence of the matter. My question to you is a bit hypothetical. What do you think that if Estonia adopts this piece of legislation, how quickly will other countries of the free world follow us? Thank you.
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball that would enable me to answer that question, but I long ago learned that those who live by the crystal ball, learn to eat ground glass. I have no crystal ball. I can't predict how quickly any other nation would follow, but I can assure you that when I speak to people in the White House and in our Treasury Department, if I were able to say that a nation like Estonia has stepped up to the plate and made clear that it will not allow these assets to remain idle, I would receive a far more encouraging response from the president and his advisors when I say, now it's your turn, now you must take the next step. But I can't predict how quickly the United States would respond, or France, or Germany, or Italy, or Japan. I think what's critical is that we all agree as a matter of principle that allowing these frozen assets to lie idle is a moral and legal abdication of our mutual responsibilities to the survival of freedom-loving countries everywhere, and an invitation to further aggression by Russia and by other nations.
aitäh, järgmisena palun
Thank
härra
you.
Vooglaid.
Now, Mr. Vooglaid's question. Thank you very much. First of all, by way of comment to what Mr. Sutt said, you said that this is not the right approach, that we're analyzing and thinking about different steps might entail. No, this is what a responsible statesman does, that we deliberate what are the impacts of our actions. Professor Tribe, you started with this reservation that you're here as a legal expert, not as a political activist, but have to say that quite a considerable part of your presentation was about political activism, because you didn't explain international law and constitutional law principles, but tried to convince us that we should make this political decision. I don't know whether you know, as an expert of constitutional law, that in Estonia we have a constitutional issue related to this issue. According to our constitution, ownership can be transferred from the owner only in cases provided by the law or in general interest for just and immediate compensation. Under no other condition. I don't know whether the US constitutional law includes this principle. If not, then it's easier for you, but we have this issue and it's a serious problem. But regarding international law, I was surprised by your approach. I have studied international law and I found your approach quite one-sided. Now, immunity principle based on sovereignty would not have any meaning if, based on political reasons, it would be possible to deviate and decide to confiscate the assets of a country. And international law would have no essence if the principles were not applied equally. And so I thought I would ask you, the same principle that you articulated, would it allow transferring US central bank assets as well, Estonian central bank assets, in order to compensate the 2003 aggression damages to Iraq for violating international law? Or the international law principles apply differently to different countries? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let me begin by saying that if you regarded my statement as lopsided, I have to apologize. I was summarizing in what I gathered I should squeeze into less than 10 minutes the result of a report that took more than 200 pages to explain. Of course, I believe that the rule of law requires that principles be applied even-handedly and not with a view to whose ox is gored and who wins and who loses. I was proceeding on the premise that Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which has been universally condemned as clearly illegal and as the attempted essentially genocidal annexation of a neighbor, that was unambiguously lawless and that the rule of law requires response that is proportional and reversible. Whereas the question of the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, which I personally opposed, raises more difficult questions of international law, which I don't think it is possible for us to resolve here. As to the question of whether the United States Constitution, like the Constitution of Estonia, requires that when private property be taken for public use, it be done only pursuant to due process and with just compensation, the answer is that that has been part of the United States Constitution ever since 1789. Private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. But that applies only, at least in the United States, to private property. States, under our Constitution, do not have property. That would be my first point. My second point is that it is utterly consistent with due process to require the aggressor to compensate the victim and not the other way around. My third point would be that if just compensation is required, that essentially means that it is Russia that must compensate Ukraine. Taken all of those things into consideration, I would not purport to be an expert in the constitutional law of Estonia. If your law requires that property not be taken from any entity, public or private, governmental or non-governmental, without certain procedures, then your law ought to provide those procedures. I doubt that you would have any difficulty finding under those procedures that Russia is the aggressor and that the property rightly belongs not any longer to Russia, but to Ukraine. In any event, when Estonia froze certain Russian assets, even though it was only tens of millions of euros and not billions of dollars, when that happened, that was already a taking of Russia's property. If that was permissible under the law of Estonia without any requirement that Russia be given the money back in the form of just compensation, then I'm not at all clear why a different principle would apply when that property that has already essentially been taken, although only immobilized, when that property is put to use for rebuilding Ukraine rather than allowing it to sit idle.
Thank you. Our time is also coming to an end here. Vabandust, jah, eesti keeles. Ühesõnaga, aitäh kõigile, kes te...
So thank you to everybody who joined. Thank you to the members of the committee. Thank you to Professor Tribe and Mr. Åslund for expressing your opinion and opening up the topic. And I would like to thank everybody who was listening. This concludes our sitting. Thank you.